It is the 2nd of October, 48 BC. Julius Caesar, fresh from his victories against the armies of the Roman Senate, pursues his deadliest foe across the Mediterranean Sea. Upon landing on the shores of Ptolemaic Egypt, Caesar is presented with a gift, but as soon as he lays eyes on what is before him, he recoils in horror. The gift is the severed head of his erstwhile enemy, a man who in life was one of Rome's greatest consuls, generals and senators, who has been butchered in the most brutal fashion. His name, Pompey the Great, the last defender of the Roman Republic. The man known to history as Pompey the Great, or Pompeius Magnus, was born Gnaeus Pompeius on the 29th of September 106 BC in Picenum, a region on the Adriatic coast of central Italy. His family was the most powerful in the region. A distant relative named Quintus Pompeius had been consul of Rome in 141 BC, the most important political office in the Roman Republic. The family was not native to Picenum though, and its origins remain unclear. Pompey's father, Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, had been a great influence on his son's life and career. He was a successful general who came to prominence while campaigning in his native Picenum during the Social War, the conflict between Rome and its erstwhile Italian allies, or socii, on the Italian peninsula from 91 BC to 87 BC. Pompeius Strabo served as consul in 89 BC and celebrated a triumph at the end of that year. Little is known about Pompey's mother. According to the Roman soldier and historian Marcus Valerius Paterculus, writing in the 1st century AD, she was a woman named Lucilia, who came from a family of senatorial rank. She bore Pompeius Strabo 2 children, the future Pompey the Great, and a daughter named Pompeia. Pompey grew up at a time of social and political upheaval. Rome had been a republic since 509 BC, at which time a centuries-old monarchy had been overthrown. The most important political office was the consulship, held by 2 individuals each year. Consuls could not serve successive terms and were expected to wait several years before holding the office again. They also had to have served a political apprenticeship, often lasting decades, before they were considered senior enough to gain election as consul. Despite these constitutional safeguards, Roman society was extremely hierarchical and based on property. The wealthiest landowners dominated the Senate, the main legislative and governing body of the Republic, while senior military commands were held by the equites or equestrians. The Roman army had traditionally been a citizen militia, with soldiers recruited from the propertied classes, though as we will see, this was changing right around the time that Pompey was born. Despite its militia-like nature, the armies of the Republic had emerged as the foremost fighting force in the Mediterranean world in the 4th, 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, allowing Rome to conquer the entire Italian peninsula by 264 BC. Over the next century, it defeated its rivals for dominance of the Western Mediterranean, Carthage, a similar sort of oligarchic republic based out of what is now Tunisia in North Africa, in the 3 Punic Wars. Thereafter, Rome continued to expand aggressively, moving into the Eastern Mediterranean, where the old Hellenistic kingdoms that had emerged out of the fragmentation of the empire of Alexander the Great were declining in strength. Pompey's career would peak here in the east, waging war on powers like the Seleucid Empire that ruled a sizable empire from Syria and the Kingdom of Pontus that controlled the southern shores of the Black Sea around what is now northern Turkey. The years prior to Pompey's birth had seen Rome continue to expand militarily around the Mediterranean, enriching the Romans with loot stripped from the newly conquered provinces and from slaves brought back to Italy from the conquered regions. Yet it was a time of contrasting fortunes. Abroad, Rome's armies seemed invincible, but at home, the Republic was fragile. Expansion and great riches had sundered the old social and economic systems of the Republic, and there were constant political tensions in the city of Rome itself. One of the issues was that the Republic's generals were becoming overly powerful, and the city's politics were also descending into overt populism, where previously the old patrician noble families had ruled through the Senate in a very conservative manner. A symptom of this instability was the rise of Gaius Marius, a powerful general who came to prominence in 109 BC during the wars against Jugurtha, king of Numidia, a region in northwestern Africa around Algeria today. In 107 BC, Marius was elected consul and appointed commander in the Numidian War. It was during this campaign that he began implementing a series of reforms which led to the establishment of the first professional Roman army, staffed with legionaries who were full-time career soldiers, rather than part-time soldiers who served a season or two in the army before returning to their farms in Italy. The Marian reforms were a common-sense approach to the need for a full-time standing army, given how much the Republic had expanded over the last 100 years. But they also sowed the seeds of the Republic's destruction. Now, if powerful and populist generals could win the support of the legions, they had tens of thousands of full-time career soldiers supporting them. While Marius was leading the Numidian War to a successful conclusion, two Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and Teutones, invaded northern Italy in large numbers, posing a major threat to Rome's safety. The Senate now elected Marius to a second consulship in 104 BC and gave him the responsibility of defeating the Germanic tribes. After rebuilding the legions on the northern frontier, Marius turned the tide of the war and served an unprecedented 5 consecutive terms as consul between 104 and 100 BC. In the meantime, Rome's allies on the Italian peninsula continued to clamor for full Roman citizenship. This would eventually lead to the Social War in 91 BC, a 4-year conflict which the Romans emerged victorious in by 87 BC, but which still ended in Rome conceding the honor of Roman citizenship to its Italian allies around the peninsula. This was the last mass enfranchisement of subject people for 3 centuries. It would not be replicated until citizenship was extended to all free citizens of the empire in the early 3rd century AD. From Pompey's perspective, the significance of the Social War was that his father was elected to serve as consul in 89 BC, in the midst of it, and played a prominent role in the war, notably in the siege of the Italian stronghold of Ausculum in the north. While little else is known about his upbringing, the young Pompey is presumed to have gained his military experience serving in his father's army during the conflict. Another young man who served under Pompeius Strabo was Marcus Tullius Cicero, who would later achieve fame as an orator and statesman, though there is no evidence that he and Pompey were closely acquainted at this early time. During his consulship in 89 BC, Pompey's father introduced a law to confer Latin rights to the Traspadane Gauls living north of the river Po, who remained loyal to Rome. These rights brought commercial privileges and were considered the first step to full Roman citizenship. Prior to celebrating his triumph in Rome on the 25th of December 89 BC, Pompeius Strabo made an unsuccessful attempt to secure another term as consul. Instead, Strabo's distant relation, Quintus Pompeius Rufus, took office in 88 BC. Cornelius Sulla, another general who had emerged as a major rival of Marius's for power in the Republic and who served as consul in 88 BC, considered Strabo's army a threat to Rome and arranged for his consular colleague to take command. But Pompeius Rufus was soon murdered on Strabo's orders. The latter took the army back to Picenum, while Sulla departed to lead a campaign against King Mithridates VI of Pontus in the Black Sea region, who took advantage of Rome's preoccupation in the social war to invade Roman territory in Asia Minor. In 87 BC, civil war broke out between the two consuls, Lucius Cornelius Cinna and Gnaeus Octavius. Cinna championed the cause of the new citizens, while Octavius sided with the conservatives. Although the former was driven out of Rome, he formed an alliance with Marius and advanced on the city. The social war was just the most consequential of numerous wars being fought by and within the Roman Republic in the 90s and 80s BC. In the midst of it, in 88 BC, Marius's younger rival for power, Sulla, marched with an army on Rome in order to coerce the Senate into granting him control over the army that was to be sent east to wage war on King Mithridates of Pontus, an unprecedented act of military aggression by a Roman general within Italy itself. The minor civil war that broke out between factions supporting Gnaeus Octavius and Lucius Cornelius Cinna, both of whom were aligned in different ways with Marius and Sulla, was an extension of this clash between the Marians and the Sullans. Even the death of Marius in 86 BC simply saw leadership of the Marian faction pass to his son and namesake and another figure by the name of Gnaeus Papirius Carbo. Hence the years ahead would continue to see ongoing conflict between the Marian and Sullan factions. Pompeius Strabo sought to benefit his own cause during this tumultuous period. However, his corruption seems to have led his own men to murder him in 87 BC, though the circumstances of his death are not entirely clear. It's possible that he also simply succumbed to some disease at the time. His death made Pompey the new leader of his family politically. He soon had to stand trial to answer charges concerning his father's corruption and embezzlement of public money during the siege of Asculum. He was ultimately acquitted, though observers noted that a few days later he married Antistia, the daughter of one of the judges. The union would end in a divorce a few years later, having not produced any children. Little is known of Pompey's whereabouts for the next 3 years. With Sulla absent in the east, Cinna and Carbo dominated the political scene in Rome. The Greco-Roman historical biographer of the 2nd century AD, Plutarch, in his Life of Pompey, one of our foremost sources on Pompey the Great, states that he became a partisan of Cinna's during these years and fled from Rome around the time that Cinna was assassinated in 84 BC. Cinna's death left Carbo and Marius Jr. in control of the government at Rome, spurring Sulla to return to Italy in 83 BC after making peace with Mithridates in the east. This began what is known as Sulla's Civil War. Although his father had been no friend of Sulla, Pompey now tied his fortunes to the general, raising a force of troops to aid him in his war against the Marians. Sulla further secured his new alliance with Pompey by offering his stepdaughter Aemilia in marriage. She was already pregnant with her recently divorced husband's child and died in childbirth a few months later. Meanwhile, with Sulla marching on Rome from the south, Marius the Younger led an army to meet him, while Carbo went north to deal with a Sullan army led by Metellus Pius, Pompey, and another man who would figure prominently in Pompey's story in years to come, Marcus Crassus. Ultimately, Sulla defeated the Marians outside Rome at the Battle of Colline Gate on the 1st of November 82 BC, Carbo fled towards North Africa to raise a new army, following which Sulla dispatched Pompey to pursue him. Carbo only got as far as Sicily when he was apprehended and executed by Pompey, an act that led some to label him Adullus Centullus Carnifex, the young butcher. After entering Rome, Sulla was the unrivaled political and military figure within the Roman Republic and claimed the power of dictatores, a position which existed within the Republic whereby a political figure or general could be temporarily given extraordinary powers during an emergency. Sulla argued that the threat to the Republic posed by his opponents merited such measures. In reality, though, he used the dictatorial powers to engage in a notorious series of proscriptions whereby lists of his political enemies, primarily former Marian supporters, were drawn up and the individuals on it were either executed or exiled. While the original list only applied to 80 people, many more names were added to the proscriptions by unscrupulous men who wished to settle personal scores and lay claim to the victim's property. Sulla used his dictatorship to strengthen the Senate by doubling its size and adding many individuals from the old Roman aristocracy. Conversely, he sought to weaken the power of the tribunes, magistrates who represented the Roman plebeian classes or commoners. Thus, he emerged firmly as a ruler who favored the optimates, or conservative, tradition-bound faction within the Republic that wanted power to remain firmly in the hands of the aristocratic Senate, while trying to weaken the populares, the populist faction who appealed more to the wider population for their support. Then, having seemingly restored stability to the Republic, Sulla relinquished his powers of dictatores in 79 BC and went into retirement in the Italian countryside. He died the following year. While all of these events were occurring in Rome, Pompey had remained in Sicily to reorganize the troops on the island after his defeat of Carbo. He was then ordered to lead a campaign against Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus in Africa, who had allied there with Iarbas, the king of Numidia. In little more than a month, Pompey defeated Domitius and Iarbas in battle in quick succession, capturing and executing both of them in the process. As a result of this victorious campaign, Pompey was hailed as Magnus, or the Great, by his troops on account of his significant military victories at such a young age. He henceforth styled himself as Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. Pompey was also said to bear a strong physical resemblance to Alexander the Great, and the new cognomen strengthened his association with the Macedonian conqueror. Fueled by a sense of his elevated prestige, he refused Sulla's order to disband his army and return to Rome until such time as the dictator agreed to allow him to hold a triumph in the city, a parade that conquering Roman generals had traditionally held upon their return home. Sulla reluctantly agreed, even though Pompey was a young man who had not attained the necessary senatorial rank to receive the honor of a triumph. On the 12th of March 81 BC, at the age of only 24, Pompey was saluted as Imperator, or Commander, at Rome as he celebrated the first of what would be 3 triumphs in the city. In 79 BC, Pompey married Mucia Tertia, his third wife in just 7 years. In the period that followed, he capitalized on the renown he had gained during Sulla's civil war, involving himself in the politics of the Republic as the dictator went into retirement, and figures like Sulla's old ally, Quintus Lutatius Catulus and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, vied for prominence. Pompey supported Lepidus's candidacy to become consul, something which led Sulla, who was not in favor of Lepidus's rise, to cut Pompey out of his will. Yet, when Sulla died later in 78 BC, Pompey helped to organize the proceedings in the Roman Forum. He was also soon bestowed with a new military command after an insurrection broke out in Etruria, a part of Italy where Sulla had granted his military veterans land at the expense of the local population. This subsequently morphed into further civil unrest as Lepidus engaged in an effort to seize power throughout Italy, during which Pompey was appointed to a senior command. Pompey confronted a Roman commander, Lepidus's second-in-command, by the name of Marcus Janius Brutus, at Mutina, present-day Modena. Pompey appears to have negotiated Brutus's surrender and promised to write to the Senate for further instructions, but the following day, Pompey had him executed, further enhancing his reputation for ruthlessness among his enemies. At the end of this latest victorious campaign, Catulus ordered Pompey to disband his army. Pompey refused, recognizing that he would lose his influence. Instead, he held out for a new command. For 2 years, Metellus Pius, a figure who Pompey had fought alongside in northern Italy during Sulla's civil war, had been fighting in Hispania, modern-day Spain, against Quintus Sertorius, an old ally of the deceased Marian leader, Cinna. Sertorius had managed to carve out a stronghold for himself in Hispania, which had become a base for the old Marian cause within the provinces. Pompey was ordered to join Metellus in Spain. The campaign was far from straightforward. He spent 77 BC facing fierce resistance from Gallic tribes encroaching into northern Hispania and the Roman possessions along the French Riviera from the Alps and the Pyrenees. A talented general and politician, Sertorius worked together with local elites and allowed them a greater share of political power than under official Roman occupation. Pompey knew that the terrain in Hispania was difficult and focused on securing control of the ports in the south and east to keep his armies supplied by sea, but he made little progress during 76 BC. He attempted to trap Sertorius as he was besieging the city of Lauron on the east coast, but Sertorius's cavalry charged against Pompey's infantry with devastating impact. Pompey was surrounded by Sertorius at his camp and could not launch a counterattack without exposing his rear and flank. Metellus's arrival on the scene prevented a complete disaster, and Sertorius withdrew. The following year, Pompey was more successful and captured Valentia. Then, rather than waiting for Metellus to join him, he became overconfident and attacked Sertorius at the river Sucro, a move which led to a victory for Sertorius. Shortly afterwards, Metellus arrived, and once again obliged Sertorius to withdraw. During the next major engagement, fought on the banks of the river Turia near Saguntum, the two armies fought each other to a standstill in a fierce battle during which Pompey's brother-in-law, Gaius Memmius, was killed. Pompey had little to show for 3 years of campaigning and complained to the Senate about a lack of funds and supplies. His request for reinforcement was granted by the consuls for 74 BC, Lucius Licinius Lucullus and Marcus Aurelius Cotta, who were about to embark on campaign against King Mithridates, Sulla's old nemesis, who had once again taken up arms against Rome in the east. With the arrival of 2 additional legions, Metellus and Pompey made progress. Sertorius was losing the support of his Spanish allies, and in 73 BC, his subordinate, Marcus Perperno Viento, assassinated him. With Sertorius out of the picture, Metellus returned to Rome, leaving Pompey to deal with Perperna. Unlike his predecessor, who preferred to avoid battle unless he enjoyed significant numerical superiority, Perperna sought a pitched battle and was soon ambushed by Pompey's men. Perperna was captured and executed along with his associates, who were responsible for Sertorius's assassination. Following Sertorius's death, southern and eastern Hispania were fully pacified, though parts of the Iberian Peninsula would remain turbulent for decades to come. Pompey remained in Hispania for several months to reorganize the provinces and build his own following among Sertorius's former supporters. At the end of 72 BC, he was on his way to Rome to assist in the suppression of the slave rebellion led by the Thracian gladiator Spartacus, which broke out the previous year. Initial rebel victories caused the Senate to panic, and it was up to Crassus, the figure Pompey had commanded alongside many years earlier and who had since become the wealthiest man in Rome, to raise 6 legions and lead them against the rebels, while the Senate recalled Pompey from Spain. After defeating part of the rebel army, Crassus pursued them to the heel of Italy and blockaded them there. Crassus hoped to defeat Spartacus on his own to prevent Pompey from sharing the glory. Spartacus managed to break out of Crassus's blockade on the 3rd attempt, but his army gradually disintegrated and was defeated piecemeal. A 5,000-strong column ran into Pompey's legions and was easily defeated, enabling Pompey to claim that he had dealt the final blow against the rebels. Pompey approached Rome but refused to enter the city without being granted a second triumph for his victories in Spain. Although Pompey remained in Equestrian, the Senate granted his request and exempted him from the age requirements Sulla had reintroduced to elect him consul for the year 70 BC alongside Crassus. After entering Rome in triumph in December 71 BC, Pompey took office as consul for 70 BC at the youthful age of 35, with Crassus serving as the other consul for the year. He was the most inexperienced individual to hold the post, since he was still not a senator and had not served in the usual string of more junior magistracies prior to becoming consul. While his father Strabo had been consul back in 89 BC, he had spent most of the year on campaign at the end of the social war. Conversely, Pompey entered office with an ambitious reform program. Top of the agenda was to restore the power of the tribunes, which Sulla had limited as dictator. Several similar initiatives had been presented to the Senate in previous years, and with both Pompey and Crassus in favor of restoring the tribunician power, the Senate decided that it was better for the people to have a constitutional means to voice their grievances than to enable demagogues to stir up trouble by unconstitutional means. They also reintroduced a check on consular power by reviving the office of censor that had been abolished by Sulla. Beyond this, not much was accomplished, and the two ambitious consuls did not work effectively together. For the next few years, with the Roman Republic broadly at peace for the first time in a great many years, Pompey had few military commands which he could attempt to acquire and retired to his country estate, his political career on something of a hiatus after his term as consul. There he raised his young family. He and his third wife, Mucia, had had a son named Gnaeus in 79 BC soon after they were married. A daughter, Pompeia, had followed around 75 BC, though the exact year of her birth is not entirely clear. Finally, in 67 BC, they had another son, named Sextus. Although he was not reputed to be as wealthy as Crassus, who had benefited enormously from seizing the estates of Sulla's enemies back in the late 80s BC, during the proscriptions of the Marians, Pompey's family estates in Picenum continued to bring in a healthy income. He kept an eye on political affairs in Rome, though he was aware that it was unusual for anyone to follow up a consulship with a second one again quickly, while his efforts to secure the magisterial office for some of his supporters during this period generally floundered. Ultimately, Pompey was more of a military man than a career senator, and he was watching and waiting during these years for a new military command. An opportunity finally opened for Pompey in 67 BC, when the tribune Aulus Gabinius proposed Pompey as the commander of a fleet of 200 ships to confront the pirates in the Mediterranean. For several decades, piracy in the Mediterranean had disrupted the grain supply into Rome and endangered the lives of Romans traveling between the provinces by sea. The frequent wars with Mithridates of Pontus and the Seleucid Empire had further encouraged pirates from Cilicia along the southern coast of Turkey to attack Roman settlements in the eastern Mediterranean. According to Plutarch, when the young Gaius Julius Caesar was captured by Cilician pirates on his way to Rhodes in 75 BC, he scoffed that his captors had set his ransom too low and offered to pay a significantly higher rate. After spending a month with his captors, while his associates raised the money, he took their leave and promised to come back and have them crucified one day. The pirates had also been a thorn in Pompey's side during his campaign against Sertorius in Spain, but piecemeal attempts by Roman commanders failed to eliminate the threat. The Senate recognized that a different approach was required after a pirate fleet attacked the harbor at Ostia in 67 BC. Under Gabinius's proposals, Pompey's authority would extend over the whole Mediterranean and up to 50 miles inland. Gabinius faced considerable opposition among the senators, who were concerned about giving Pompey such extensive powers over much of the Roman world. However, he eventually overcame the senatorial opposition. A second law was soon enacted to appoint Pompey to his command, and he was given control over an enormous fleet of 250 ships with upwards of 100,000 soldiers and mariners. Pompey approached the challenge of ridding the Mediterranean of the pirates methodically, dividing what the Romans were coming to know as Mare Nostrum, RC, into at least 15 regions, each under one of his sub-commanders. He began his campaign by focusing on the western Mediterranean, enabling the secure transport of corn from Sardinia, Sicily, and North Africa to feed the masses of Roman citizens in Rome and Italy. While these measures were extraordinarily successful, Pompey was being undermined by the consul Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a senatorial opponent who was due to govern Transalpine Gaul in southern France after the end of his consular term. Piso used his influence to prevent the province from cooperating with Pompey's agents, creating difficulties for the general and pointing yet again to the constant cutthroat nature of Roman politics during these years. Next, Pompey ordered his legates to blockade the eastern Mediterranean ports, except for those in Cilicia, in order to encourage the pirates to return to their home base. He then proceeded to engage the pirates in a decisive battle at Coracesium in Cilicia, now the Turkish port of Alanya, where Pompey forced his enemies to surrender. He resettled the defeated pirates among several cities in Cilicia, including the port of Soli, which he renamed Pompeiopolis, the city of Pompey, in his own honor. Pompey had been given 3 years to carry out the task of eliminating the pirates, and while he did not eradicate them entirely, within months he had largely cleared the entire Mediterranean of piratical activity. Pompey soon received word that he had been appointed in 66 BC to succeed Lucius Licinius Lucullus as commander in the ongoing war against Mithridates of Pontus. Lucullus had been in the region since 73 BC and had initially achieved great success, driving the enemy out of the Roman province of Bithynia and occupying much of Pontus itself. Mithridates fled to Armenia and sought aid from King Tigranes II, his son-in-law. Despite defeating Tigranes at the Battle of Tigranocerta in October 69 BC and occupying his capital, Artaxata, Lucullus soon lost the confidence of his troops, enabling Mithridates and Tigranes to regain all their territory. From 69 BC, the Senate began to have doubts about Lucullus's capacity to win the war, and gradually reduced his authority. Then in 66 BC, the tribune Gaius Manlius successfully passed a bill in the Senate recalling Lucullus and appointing Pompey to his command. Pompey retained command of the men and ships he was given for the pirate war, enabling him to use his fleet to secure his lines of communication to Rome and combine the men already under his command with Lucullus's old army. He was given wide-ranging authority over the Roman provinces in the eastern Mediterranean, allowing him to appoint several close associates as his legates, including Lucius Afranius, his old comrade from the war against Sertorius in Hispania, as well as his wife's half-brother, Quintus Metellus Sulla, and his ally in Rome, Aulus Gabinius. With these, he would embark on his greatest campaign yet. Pompey began with a diplomatic initiative to isolate Mithridates by encouraging King Phraates III of Parthia, a great kingdom which then ruled over Persia and Mesopotamia in what are now Iran and Iraq, to invade Armenia and distract Tigranes. Early in the campaign, Pompey had an ill-humored meeting with Lucullus, who labeled him a vulture and accused him of stealing the glory that he was about to obtain by winning victory over the kingdom of Pontus. Lucullus soon left for Rome, taking only 1,600 men with him to the capital, where he would face a major struggle to be awarded a triumph in recognition of his victories in the east. Several years of warfare had already left the kingdom of Pontus devastated, and Mithridates had pursued a scorched earth strategy to deprive the advancing Roman legions of food and supplies. The king was obliged to leave his initial defensive position as his water supply was running low, and his army was defeated in battle by Pompey at the river Lycus in 66 BC. Mithridates escaped with 800 horsemen and attempted to seek refuge with Tigranes once again, but on this occasion he was refused aid by the Armenians. The elder Tigranes was keen to end the war quickly and agreed to give up his conquests and become a vassal of Rome, although Armenia would remain a buffer state for centuries thereafter, constantly changing its loyalties between the Romans and the Parthians. Although Pompey had defeated Mithridates and forced Tigranes to submit, he continued to face opposition from smaller kingdoms in the region. In 65 BC, he was attacked by Oroesis, ruler of the ancient kingdom of Albania, a state which lay in the eastern Caucasus, roughly modern Azerbaijan, not to be confused with Albania in the Western Balkans. Pompey and his lieutenants defeated the Albanians in battle, and Oroesis made peace later that year. He then launched a preemptive invasion of neighboring Iberia, forcing King Artoses to come to terms. The Albanians took advantage of Pompey's absence to resume hostilities and were decisively defeated at the river Abbas, which may refer to the river Alazani on the border of Georgia and Azerbaijan. Pompey adopted a tactic he first encountered among Sertorius's men in Hispania, ordering his infantry to kneel down behind the cavalry to conceal them from the enemy. When the Albanians attacked, the Roman cavalry fell back behind the infantrymen, who stood up and closed ranks to meet the charge. Pompey's horsemen wheeled around and enveloped the enemy on both flanks. Following this victory, Pompey was confident enough to send his subordinates to secure key strategic areas, while he led the remainder of his army on an exploratory expedition towards the Caspian Sea, this being as far into the region as any Roman army had traversed. By 64 BC, Pompey was confident enough to send some of his subordinates back to Rome to shore up his political position in the capital. He then led his army south into Syria. Here he faced the remnants of the Seleucid Empire, a once great power, though one which had been hugely weakened by numerous wars with Rome, stretching back to the 190s BC, and also by the rise of the Parthian Empire on its eastern flank, and the Armenians to the north. Following his victory over Tigranes in 69 BC, Lucullus had recognized the Seleucid king King Antiochus XIII as the legitimate ruler of Syria. However, Pompey intended for Syria, a very wealthy part of the Mediterranean world, to become a Roman province, and waged a swift and devastating war against the Seleucids. He had King Antiochus deposed and killed before turning his attention to Judea, which was in the midst of a power struggle between the brothers Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, members of the Hasmonean dynasty of native Jewish rulers. While Aristobulus enjoyed the advantage, Hyrcanus formed an alliance with Aretas, the ruler of the neighboring kingdom of Nabatea, the rulers of which had grown rich in their great city of Petra by controlling the spice caravan routes between the Mediterranean and Arabia. The Romans arrived while Aretas was besieging Jerusalem and forced him to break the siege. Then, in the spring of 63 BC, Pompey met the warring brothers in Damascus and offered a peace deal. While Hyrcanus was inclined to accept, Aristobulus returned to Jerusalem, intent on fighting the Romans. He soon changed his mind and surrendered, but the inhabitants continued to resist for 3 months. After entering Jerusalem, Hyrcanus was installed by Pompey as ruler of Judea, but he had to settle for the title of high priest rather than king. The kingdom of Judea was established by Pompey as a client state or vassal of Rome. Pompey had now conquered virtually all of the states that had continued to resist Roman rule in the eastern Mediterranean through a series of swift and immensely successful military campaigns between 66 BC and 63 BC. After receiving news that Mithridates, who had fled to the lands on the northern end of the Black Sea, had ordered his own men to slay him, Pompey began to reorganize the newly conquered territories into Roman provinces and client kingdoms. Then he set sail for Italy. In late 62 BC, he landed at Brundisium, in the south of the peninsula, and promptly dismissed his army to quell fears that he might try to emulate Sulla and march on Rome. The general and his entourage were welcomed on their way to Rome, but a faction in the Senate that was opposed to the rise of a new all-conquering general in the vein of Marius or Sulla was anxious to prevent him from acquiring too much power. Even before he arrived in Rome, Pompey requested a divorce from his wife Mucia, perhaps in the hope of entering into a new marriage alliance with the family of the young orator and rising leader of the Optimates faction in the Senate, Marcus Porcius Cato. The incorruptible Cato rejected Pompey's overtures and would become one of Pompey's leading critics, though they would soon find common ground against a rising populist politician, Gaius Julius Caesar. In September 61 BC, Pompey celebrated his third triumph, a magnificent 2-day spectacle that coincided with his 45th birthday. It was highly unusual for any Roman general to celebrate 3 triumphs in his lifetime, let alone to do so by his mid-40s, something which points towards Pompey's exalted status in the Republic after his Asian campaign. The wealth of the East had enabled Pompey to make a generous payment to his men and bestow a vast sum into Rome's state coffers. The general also increased his personal fortune, allowing him to build a house at the Pincian Hill in Rome and a large villa outside Rome. He ordered the construction of the city's first permanent theatre in the Campus Martius, or Field of Mars, outside the gates of Rome, a move designed to curry favor with the common people of Rome. His political priorities in the Senate were to secure a land settlement for his army veterans and to acquire official recognition of his reorganization of the eastern provinces, efforts which met with some resistance. He found a surprise ally in eventually achieving these goals when Julius Caesar gained election as consul in 59 BC. Pompey, Caesar, and a third individual, Marcus Crassus, whom Pompey had campaigned alongside against Spartacus's revolt over a decade earlier, now formed a political alliance known as the First Triumvirate. Caesar, who at this stage was the more junior partner, living in the shadows of the glory Pompey had acquired over 2 decades of successful military campaigns, managed to engineer the passage of legislation through the Senate to reward Pompey's veterans with land and wealth, while Pompey now married Caesar's daughter Julia, who was only around 17 years old at the time, to cement the political alliance. Pompey's surprise alliance with Caesar complicated his relations with more conservative and traditional senators like Cato and Cicero. In 59 BC, Pompey and Caesar attempted to undermine Cicero by supporting his political rival, Publius Claudius Pulcher, a dangerous demagogue from the wealthy and privileged Claudian family. As an elite patrician, Claudius was prevented from becoming a tribune, but Pompey and Caesar arranged for Claudius to be adopted by a plebeian man who immediately emancipated him, making him eligible to be elected as a plebeian tribune. After securing the office for 58 BC, Claudius attacked Cicero. He convened a meeting in which he denounced the great orator for his handling of a political emergency in Rome known as the Catilinarian conspiracy that had occurred back in 63 BC during Cicero's term as consul. While Cicero went into voluntary exile as a result of these attacks, Claudius continued his assault on his reputation and passed a law declaring him to be an enemy of the state, leading to the confiscation of his property. Pompey may have hoped that his acquiescence to Claudius's anti-Cicero measures would advantage him in the short term, but then Claudius, believing he could dispense with his former allies as his power base grew, sought to interfere with Pompey's organization of the East. Pompey therefore engaged in a volte-face and began lobbying for Cicero's recall. Several attempts to do so were vetoed by Claudius and his allies, and it was only in September 57 BC that Cicero was able to return to Rome. As part of his political vendetta against Cicero, Claudius attempted to instigate riots in the city by manipulating the supply of grain to Rome's masses. With Cicero's backing, Pompey was given a temporary commission to regulate the grain supply. While his efforts temporarily restored Pompey's popularity among the people, Claudius continued to instigate opposition to Pompey in 56 BC. In response to these actions, and despite his discomfort with Caesar, who after his term as consul in 59 BC had elected to become governor of Gaul, and was then engaged in a series of spectacularly successful military campaigns there throughout the 50s BC, ones which saw him threaten to eclipse the achievements of Pompey in the 70s and 60s BC, Pompey nevertheless renewed the First Triumvirate alliance with Caesar and Crassus at a meeting in Lucca in 56 BC. Pompey and Crassus were then elected as the 2 consuls for 55 BC, the second time the 2 men had held the office together, as the trio effectively began to divide up political power within the Republic between them. Caesar would continue his conquests in Gaul, even crossing over twice to Britain in 55 and 54 BC, as he considered the feasibility of a military conquest of the south of the island with its rich tin mines, while Crassus headed east to Syria, where he now sought his own military renown through a successful war with the Parthian Empire. At home in Rome, Pompey inaugurated his theatre in the city in August 55 BC, after years of building work. Still, he must have been conscious that of the 3 members of the alliance, he appeared very much as the lion in winter, the general whose glory days were behind him, while Caesar garnered acclaim for his actions in Gaul. In late 55 BC, Crassus departed for Syria and embarked on his disastrous Parthian campaign, which would culminate in his defeat and death at the Battle of Carrhae in June 53 BC. Pompey delegated his provincial commands to loyal subordinates and chose to remain in Rome. While he was unassailable in the Senate, his supporters and associates were targeted. In September 54 BC, Pompey's friend Aulus Gabinius was put on trial for treason for intervening in Egypt on his own initiative while serving as governor of Syria. Although he was acquitted, he was found guilty of extortion and exiled. Around the same time, Pompey suffered a personal tragedy when his wife Julia died during childbirth. For the time being, his alliance with Caesar remained secure, and the latter suggested that he should marry Caesar's great niece Octavia, while Caesar would divorce his wife Calpurnia to marry Pompey's daughter Pompeia, though Pompey did not agree to this arrangement. In the meantime, there was a breakdown of political order in Rome, and the consular elections for 53 BC were delayed by a year, with the result that the two consuls were elected halfway into their terms. As the political unrest spilled into January 52 BC, Claudius was killed in the violence racking the capital. His supporters responded by burning his body inside the Senate house, destroying the building in the process. The Senate convened in an alternative venue, and on the 1st of February passed a measure making Pompey sole consul for the year. Pompey spent the next few months restoring political order in Rome. He appointed Metellus Scipio as his consular colleague for the remainder of the year, and married Scipio's daughter, Cornelia Metella, the widow of Crassus's son Publius, who had been killed at Carrhae alongside his father. Some of Pompey's efforts to restore order during this period, by eliminating corrupt practices, undermined the interests of his ally Julius Caesar, who had sent his lieutenant, Mark Antony, to Rome to try and gain election as quaestor and then tribune. Caesar feared that he would be put on trial for his actions as consul in 59 BC. While he enjoyed immunity from prosecution as a provincial governor, once recalled to Rome, he would be vulnerable and needed allies in prominent offices to offset the possibility of this happening. Caesar hoped that before he returned to Rome, he could be elected consul in absentia, so that he could begin his term immediately after celebrating a triumph and retain his immunity. While Pompey granted the right for Caesar to stand for election in absentia, he also passed a law preventing anyone else from doing so. In order to prevent consular candidates from bribing their way to the office by relying on future income as provincial governors, Pompey passed a measure introducing a 5-year interval between a consulship and a provincial governorship. The Gallic Wars were over, and Pompey's legislation strengthened calls for Caesar's recall. Effectively, this signaled the collapse of the First Triumvirate. In the spring of 50 BC, Pompey seemed to indicate his support for a proposal to extend Caesar's term to November, enabling him to be elected consul for the following year, return to Rome, and hold a triumph at the end of the year. However, the proposal was blocked by the tribune, Scribonius Curio, who had recently become Caesar's ally, indicating that Caesar did not trust Pompey's intentions. At various times, both Caesar and Pompey suggested that both should agree to lay down their commands, but neither could feel secure without an army backing them. By the end of the year, with rumors abounding that Caesar was marching south towards Rome, in violation of the law, the generals could not bring legions into Italy south of the river Rubicon. Pompey agreed to take command of 2 legions to defend the city. On the 7th of January 49 BC, the Senate authorized Roman officials in Italy to take whatever measures they considered necessary to protect the state. Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius, 2 tribunes who supported Caesar, were threatened by the Senate and fled Rome, heading for Caesar's camp near the river Rubicon, which marked the border between Italy and the province of Cisalpine Gaul. While Caesar only had the 13th Legion at his disposal, on the night of the 10th of January 49 BC, he made the momentous decision to cross the Rubicon. Additional forces were also being led southwards towards Italy from throughout Gaul. Pompey was surprised by Caesar's decision to march on Rome with only limited forces during the winter, and did not have time to raise an army to defend the capital. He decided to abandon the city on the 17th of January and summoned all officials to join him at his camp at Capua in southern Italy. He had the support of a large section of the more conservative element within the Senate, the Optimates faction, splitting the Republic politically as these senators left the capital to join the Pompeian forces. Thus, Caesar's actions in crossing the river Rubicon initiated a new civil war. Pompey may have decided to leave Rome itself to spare the city and its inhabitants from bloodshed, while his subordinate, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, attempted to make a stand in northern Italy. When Pompey refused to come to his aid, Domitius surrendered to Caesar, and his 13,000 men joined Caesar's ranks. Pompey then prepared to evacuate the whole of Italy and assembled a fleet at Brundisium. By the time Caesar reached the port in early March, most of Pompey's army had already crossed the Adriatic. Meanwhile, with Rome left open for him to occupy it, and the rump Senate firmly comprised of his supporters, Caesar had the power of dictatores that Sulla had claimed over 3 decades earlier bestowed on him. Unlike Sulla, Caesar would never voluntarily relinquish these powers. Pompey's escape from Brundisium gave him the strategic advantage. He could train up his army in Greece, drawing further forces to him from around the eastern Mediterranean, while troops in Hispania that favored Pompey's cause threatened Caesar from the west. Caesar could not find enough ships to pursue Pompey, although he managed to take Sardinia and sent Curio to expel Cato from Sicily. Curio then landed in North Africa, where he was killed in battle against King Juba of Numidia. Caesar led 6 legions to Hispania and gained the upper hand against Pompey's subordinates, while Pompey recruited a large number of men and ships in the east. After briefly returning to Rome to organize elections for the year 48 BC, Caesar headed for Brundisium, determined to pursue Pompey and bring him to a decisive battle. His fleet was still not large enough, and he could only take 15,000 men with him in a single crossing, leaving the rest with Mark Antony. Caesar set sail on the 4th of January. While Pompey's fleet commander, Bibulus, failed to stop him, he destroyed dozens of Caesar's transport ships as they returned to Brundisium. Pompey had dispersed his troops into winter quarters at Dyrrachium and Apollonia, in Illyricum, modern-day Albania. After taking control of Apollonia, Caesar moved on to Dyrrachium, but was unable to dislodge Pompey. When Antony crossed the Adriatic in late March to reinforce Caesar, Pompey hoped to ambush him and prevent him from joining Caesar, but his plans were leaked, and he had to return to Dyrrachium. While Pompey could count on supplies reaching him by sea and hoped to starve Caesar of supplies, Caesar took steps to restrict Pompey's access to fresh water on land. In July, Pompey successfully broke through Caesar's lines, but failed to win a complete victory. The stage was now set for the final showdown between Caesar and Pompey. With the breaking of the blockade, Caesar decided to march east towards Macedonia, where one of his sub-commanders, Domitius Calvinus, was facing 2 legions under Metellus Scipio, Pompey's father-in-law. Rather than turn to invade Italy, Pompey now decided to march to Scipio's aid, and followed Caesar eastwards. By August, the 2 armies faced each other near Pharsalus in southern Thessaly. Pompey was encamped at the top of a hill, while Caesar deployed his legions on the plain below. Caesar sought to tempt Pompey into a pitched battle on several occasions. While Pompey initially held firm, a few days later he changed his mind and engaged Caesar in battle, confident that he could gain victory with 38,000 infantry to Caesar's 22,000, and a much superior cavalry force. Pompey envisaged his cavalry making a decisive attack against Caesar's right flank, hammering Caesar's army against the anvil of his infantry. However, Caesar observed the movements of Pompey's cavalry commander, Labienus, and ambushed him with 1,000 of his own cavalry. Although Pompey's center and right held, Caesar's cavalry tore through his left, and Pompey was forced to flee. Despite his significant numerical superiority, Pompey had been defeated at Pharsalus, an engagement which would prove to be the decisive clash of the civil war. Many of Pompey's subordinates were killed or captured by Caesar at Pharsalus, but Pompey was determined to rebuild an army to continue the fight. He sailed to Asia Minor and received some reinforcements there, picking up his wife Cornelia from Mytilene along the way. After considering his options, Pompey decided to seek refuge in Egypt from the teenage King Ptolemy XIII. Ptolemy was involved in a power struggle with his sister, wife and co-ruler Cleopatra VII, and his advisors believed that it was better to make a deal with the victorious Caesar and ordered the Roman officer, Lucius Septimus, to assassinate Pompey as he landed at Pelusium on the Nile Delta on the 28th of September 48 BC, one day before his 58th birthday. 3 days later, Caesar arrived in Egypt and was presented with Pompey's head. He was disgusted to find his rival and former ally dead, and may have intended to display his magnanimity towards Pompey in victory by pardoning him. Caesar would soon return to Rome triumphant, and would hold the power of dictatores there down to his assassination in 44 BC. He would never proclaim himself to be an all-powerful ruler or emperor, but his actions paved the way for his great-nephew, Octavian, to rise as the first emperor of Rome in 27 BC, after defeating Mark Antony in a power struggle to succeed to Caesar's position of preeminence within the Republic. Ironically, when Caesar was killed in 44 BC, it was during a meeting of the Senate in the theatre of Pompey. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus was one of the foremost generals and political figures of Roman history, a man who was known as the Great even in his own time. Beginning in his early 20s, he commenced a military career which saw him win renown, fighting first for Sulla during the civil war that brought him to power, and then in campaigns against Sertorius in Hispania and Spartacus in southern Italy. Yet it was his lengthy campaigns in the eastern Mediterranean in the 60s BC that truly won him acclaim, defeating the Cilician pirates and then moving on to engage in a series of brilliant campaigns that reduced the kingdoms of Pontus and Judea, along with the Seleucid Empire, to Roman rule. As a result of these, he was awarded 3 triumphs at Rome by his 45th year, an unprecedented accomplishment. His tragedy was that he was eclipsed in the 50s BC by Julius Caesar, with Pompey's exploits becoming a distant memory as news seemed to arrive every month of fresh successes for Caesar in Gaul. Yet Pompey's historical legacy was assured when he led the conservative senatorial resistance to Caesar's efforts to seize power after crossing the Rubicon early in 49 BC. In doing so, Pompey, though quickly defeated, appeared to be the great champion of the Roman Republic, though whether he sought to preserve the Republic or wanted to simply claim power for himself instead of Caesar remains open to question. What do you think of Pompey the Great? Was he a brilliant leader who helped Rome to win great honor and prestige and defended the traditions of the Roman Republic? Or was he a power-hungry despot himself who was simply outmaneuvered by Julius Caesar in the struggle for absolute power within the Roman Republic? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.